right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. It's a great snow day in the DC area for some of us. So appreciate everyone taking the time to join us. We've got an excellent panel for you today. So today's panel session is on generative AI, and specifically in the DoD acquisition lifecycle. We're going to explore opportunities for using generative AI for improving acquisition outcomes, as well as the risks that they may pose. Our discussion will cover potential for AI in such areas as capability development, modernization of legacy systems, and test and evaluation. I'm thrilled to be here today with an excellent panel who I will briefly introduce, and then we'll dive straight into the questions. Our first panelist is Dr. Douglas Schmidt. He is currently serving as the Director of Operational Test and Evaluation at the Office of Secretary of Defense. Prior to DOT&E, Dr. Schmidt was the Cornelius Vanderbilt Professor of Engineering and Computer Science, the Associate Chair of Computer Science, and a Senior Researcher at the Institute for Software and Integrated Systems at Vanderbilt University. He is an expert in the application of AI in defense contexts. His recent research has focused on prompt engineering techniques and patterns that enhance the accuracy and expressiveness of large language models and generative augmented intelligence. Dr. Schmidt has a long history of engaging in DoD research and has served on the Air Force Science Advisory Board and as a program manager for DARPA. Dr. Schmidt received his bachelor's and master's from William & Mary and a doctorate degree in computer science from the University of California, Irvine. At the end of this week, in fact, Director Schmidt will be returning to his alma mater, William & Mary, as the inaugural Dean of William & Mary School of Computing, Data Science, and Physics. Our next panelist is Ms. Alexis Bonnell. Alexis is the Chief Information Officer and Director of the Digital Capabilities Directorate at AFRL, specializing in the innovation and technology integration. She leads strategic development of highly advanced next-generation technologies and platforms for AFRL, to include NIPR GPT and generative AI capabilities. Prior to her current position, she was emerging technology and evangelist at Google, driving the use of emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, zero trust, API first, big data, cloud computing, and others. She has 2 bachelor's degrees in public relations and advertising from Pepperdine University, which I would imagine was a beautiful place to go to school, and a master in science in direct and interactive marketing from New York University, and an executive master's in business administration. Our next panelist is Mr. John Robert. John is the principal engineer at the Software Engineering Institute and currently serves as the deputy director of the Software Solutions Division. In this role, Mr. Robert leads software engineering research and development efforts in partnership with programs in the Department of Defense and industry. He is a co-author on Architecting the Future of Software Engineering, a national agenda for software engineering research, institute, and development. Robert holds a master in software engineering from CMU and a BS in electrical engineering from West Virginia University. He is currently working on his PhD in computer science from Vanderbilt. Our last panelist for today is Dr. Heather Wojton. Heather is the director of the Operational Evaluation Division at the Institute for Defense Analyses, with expertise in test design, program evaluation, and data science and defense test and evaluation. Previously, Dr. Wojton served as IDA's Director, Research Quality, and Chief Data Officer. Heather has worked to advance methods for test design, modeling and simulation, validation, data management and curation, and artificial intelligence testing in the DoD. She has a doctorate in experimental psychology from the University of Toledo and a bachelor's degree in research psychology from Marietta College. All right, well, with that, no further ado, let's jump into the panel session today. First up, we have a series of general questions and then some specifics based on our panelist expertise. As we are going through the talk or the session today, if you have questions you would like to ask the panelists, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. And we will get to as many as we have time for. So my first general question is, for the panel is, what are the most promising applications of generative AI in the DoD acquisition lifecycle? And how can these capabilities transform processes like capability development and support modernization? Ms. Bonnell, can I kick it over to you to kick us off?
Sure, you can. One of the things I would love to do, Laura, is oftentimes when I join these panels, especially when we talk about new technologies, is just to anchor a little bit of like, what does this mean? People hear a lot about AI, but maybe in answering the question, I can give a little bit of a framework at a human level. So I think the way that I like to think about artificial intelligence is really augmentation, right, of my capacities as a human. And it's really about the relationship with knowledge that I can have at speed and scale. Now, one of the things I think that's important to understand about why AI is different and why, it allows us to do things that I'm going to talk about, to your example, is because previously our relationship with knowledge, especially in DoD and government, was very much one of control, right? Structure. I want to clean, organize, perfect, all of that information. And we have big platforms, systems, ERPs, all of those things. And as people, we would have to learn to use them, navigate them, all of those elements. I think what's particularly important to understand about generative AI is that when you think about that controlled relationship with knowledge, we're really only putting a small fraction of our knowledge in play. So what generative AI allows us to do now is take unstructured information, unstructured knowledge. And if you think about it, a lot of that is our most incredible treasure, right? It's after actions, it's research, it's white papers, it's contract, elements. It's all of the things that, are not structured, but are critical to our function and our ability to maintain advantage. So what becomes critical now with generative AI is for the first time in human history, we actually can put all of the knowledge in play. And so what that means is we think about the role of AI or what it could or couldn't do for us in generative AI, is it really is important to anchor that with the idea, well, is what do we want to do with that knowledge and make good decisions around that? So if you think about that, I think there's a couple of different elements this brings out. The first is it allows us to move not just from a controlled relationship, but also a curiosity-based one. So if I think about acquisition, it may be easier for me to do market research or awareness of alternatives, collectively before I even think about, is this something I need to build, buy, partner, et cetera. I also think that it's really important to understand what's unique about generative AI is its ability to be a really intimate technology. So up until this point, as a CIO, I might put forward a platform and y'all have to use it and suffer through it. Now with generative AI, if Heather, or John, have a relationship with a particular set of information, let's say they work on the F-35 project, they could curate for themselves, incredible project, program, budget, and other information. And they actually get to determine the relationship with what knowledge universe they want. And I highlight that because as acquisition professionals or others kind of in this process, it's important to understand that generative AI now allows us to have a collective relationship with knowledge, but also individual to our role, our mission in a way that we hadn't had before. So that being said, I think there's a few things that I would highlight that I'm seeing that I'm excited by. The first is we're seeing, for example, our coders get a 25 to 85% productivity increase in what they're able to do with the help of generative AI. We're also seeing generative AI actually be able to break down in terms of system modernization, break down a lot of what we may have received from vendors or implementers and actually let us get some insight on what we might have an easier job of modernizing. So for example, the AI can often look at a system and say, this is complex code or easy code. And if we needed to transition or update it, I can now get insights very rapidly, which used to take kind of years and large reviews. I think we're also going to see big changes in workflows. So we're already seeing tools like ActBot, or other things that are specific to acquisition workflows. One I'm really excited about is actually around foreign direct sales disclosures. So there are a lot of processes that are very rigorous, very important, but quite frankly, really hard, right? And not necessarily pleasant. And so as we look to AI, that's another. I think we're also seeing AI being able to look at things like, a particular example I like was, kind of post contractual or other structural elements of something that we had acquired, and the AI was able to go back and see if there were any harmful chemicals that were part of the thing that we acquired and be able to kind of flag, hey, this thing we didn't know that was harmful 20 years ago, we know that it is now. And so actually, here's what it's in, and here actually are where those things are, so that we can have humans take a bit more extra precaution, to deal with that. And the final element I would say, as people think about this, is think about, AI and that relationship with knowledge that you want at that human level. The kind of 4 ways we're seeing people go on this journey. The first is they look at the generative AI to reduce their pain, right? What are the things they hate doing, or just are hard or time suck, and so that's a great way to think about the generative AI. Like, what do I not like doing? What takes so much time? What's the toil? And how do I reduce that? So that's usually the first stage. The second is, as I mentioned, kind of prioritization, meaning, oh, wow, now that I can organize my knowledge in the way that I want to, people are starting to curate that knowledge around themselves, their roles. Then what happens is they start moving into process adjustment, right? So now that I've kind of taken the pain, I've organized my relationship with knowledge, now I can start to optimize my workflow, my process, what I might do differently. And the final one that I think we'll see more of this year is what we call proxy. And that's where, I have all of that in control. Now, what do I actually want to look at generative AI to do on my behalf? We call that agentics in AI. What do we want an agent to do? So that was a little bit of a large frame, but hopefully, it's not about the AI, it's about what you as a person can do differently, or more in a more augmented way now.
Fantastic. Thank you, Alexis. John, would you like to jump in next?
Sure, thank you. Those are great ideas, and like Alexis said, it's about that interaction between humans and the knowledge set and the data information from generative AI. I think there's several different areas that were already mentioned. I'll just add a few more. I think one of the areas that's very exciting from a software engineering and acquisition standpoint is prototyping. One of the exciting aspects is that generative AI is an accelerator, right? It can help bring ideas to the forefront very quickly. So that means generative AI can help accelerate the creation of a software prototype or a software model very quickly. And that extends into some other areas, such as, for example, maybe thinking about, hey, we'd really like to see if the software can do this for the mission. Can we try this new idea? It can accelerate a small test to extend current software in new ideas and new ways. And I think a third thing related to prototyping is about integrating with new interfaces. So, these systems that we have today, they're not isolated. They're connected to so many different other systems. And one of the most common aspects is trying to connect software to different systems. And it turns out having generative AI support extending it to new interfaces can be very, very beneficial for the mission. A second area I'd like to highlight is on software verification, and this gets into some of the stuff Alexis mentioned about maybe an area where people don't want to spend as much time because it's very cumbersome or very time consuming. So software verification involves a lot of testing, and generative AI is excellent at helping creating test cases, but it can also be very helpful for creating modeling and doing some data analytics related to software verification. And then third is on regulatory and policy compliance. We live in the acquisition community with a lot of regulatory documents, PDF documents, Word documents of all shapes and forms. And a lot of human-intensive activity is about comparing the results from a current system or acquisition to those regulatory documents to see if there is consistency or inconsistency. I think it turns out that generative AI is very good at handing it information. For example, here's a regulatory document and here's some information, and then asking it to highlight areas where things are not consistent or where there's maybe gaps. So this is something that really helps deal with large data sets of information, but also has generative AI helping to augment or support humans in that activity.
Fantastic. Heather, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll just pile on a little bit here to follow on John's point about prototyping. I think you can prototype the software itself, but one of the things we're really excited about in testing is getting the warfighters involved with the system as early as possible. This is one of the things that we know leads to successful outcomes out in the field. So, you can use these generative AI models to help develop what the actual interface would look like that these operators are going to be interacting with. And we can start to do user testing much earlier, right? Instead of waiting until much later in the acquisition process where we have a fully developed interface, we can start to create these mock-ups much more quickly and iterate through them. And we can use collective knowledge about what makes a good interface, right? We know we have lots and lots of years of experience and research in the DoD about what makes interfaces work for warfighters, but also for people in general. And we can sort of bring that collective knowledge to bear much more quickly. And then, of course, use that feedback to make tweaks around the edges. And so that is something I'm really excited about in terms of how do we get operators involved earlier and help introduce them as part of the iteration of testing and design. The other big one I'm excited about is synthetic environments. So we're starting to do this already. One of the big things in operational testing is that we have to create a set of operational conditions in which to place the system and its operators so that we can figure out whether the system will perform as intended, right? Is it effective? Is it suitable in a combat environment? And a lot of that scenario building and thinking through, okay, how do I meet all of the criteria in my test design? How do I design scenarios that look like that? There's a promise of being able to sort of tell the machine, here is my test design. Help me develop a set of scenarios. What would need to be included in those scenarios? And it can create initial drafts, which then the test community can iterate on, which I think, is very exciting. And in fact, we've started to see a little bit of this happen in our operational testing already. And so we're excited to see that, I think, continue. That's a very concrete time saver, I think, for the test community.
So a lot to be excited about. But already seeing the questions flying in the chat, so thank you everyone. Our next question is actually going to reflect on what are the biggest risks or challenges for integrating generative AI into the acquisition workflows, and how can they be mitigated? I'll flag just one question from the chat as our panelists ponder that question from Ralph DeLuca, who asked, how do you propose addressing the risks of unknowns regarding the data and the models used for the output? So that being one specific risk, if anyone wants to grab that. But before we get there, I'll turn it over to Doug for kind of the opening thoughts on biggest risks and challenges.
Super, thanks, Laura. As with any emerging technology, there's a couple of risks we have to think about head on, and they relate to people and tooling or platforms. So let's take people first. So even though generative AI has been out in the public for about 2 years now, just a little bit over 2 years, a lot of people still aren't very well versed with it. And even people who have become acquainted with it are often not using it as effectively as they could. And so one of the challenges we have is trying to get people who are going to be users to come up to speed as rapidly as possible on the patterns and best practices in order to be able to get these large language models and other generative AI tools to do our bidding, as opposed to leading us down the primrose path with hallucinations and so on. So I think crucially important there to mitigate that risk is education. It's getting people aware of what's possible. It's getting people to start kicking the tires and trying this stuff. And there's also, of course, a tremendously large number of good resources available free of charge on things like the Coursera platform. If people want to go and learn more about prompt engineering, there's some wonderful courses you can take. One of my colleagues from Vanderbilt, Jules White, has a dozen or more MOOCs, massive open online courses on prompt engineering. So that's a good place to start to try to address the workforce risk. And this is very important as we start moving beyond the early adopters who have taken the time often to master these patterns and best practices and unleash these technologies to the broader workforce. And people there may not always be as well-versed in what to look for, how to be skeptical. Measured skepticism is the order of the day when dealing with the output for large language models. So that's one set of things. Second thing I think I'll mention here briefly is technology and tooling. So one of the challenges we have right now for the DoD and other high stakes domains like law or healthcare, where you really don't want people making decisions based on hallucinations, is that we have the schism between some really good models that are available in public. And these would be things like the latest versions of ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude and so on. But the downside with those is that there's not a lot of security for the data. If you put prompts in, that data will be collected. You give it the data, then in often cases, the data that you give it will be used for training, which isn't necessarily bad in general, but it's very risky for the DoD and other people who don't want their information out in the wild. On the other hand, we have these open source versions like Llama and other models that you see that you can make available in your own private enclaves, which is good if you're willing to have the IT support to build your own infrastructure. The downside is those models are often not as sophisticated, and so you tend to see a lot more hallucinations, especially if you don't use them properly. So getting the right mix of privacy-preserving infrastructure with the latest and greatest models is crucially important, but it's also important for people to realize, coming back to the prompt engineering piece, that the more context you can provide in the way you interact with these tools, the more likely you are to get results that will be meaningful. And just to riff off what Alexis said earlier, it really is at the moment about augmented intelligence. It's not about trying to replace people. It's not trying to supplant people. It's about enhancing and supplementing and enriching. But we still have to have the humans in the loop. So getting people to realize these tools are quite effective when used properly, but they still make mistakes. And being able to treat them in a trust but verify like model is going to be crucially important for the medium term and short term success of getting these technologies to transition across the valley of death in the DoD.
Fantastic. Alexis, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I would love to follow that. I think, to that point, Doug was spot on to really highlight kind of the human and the machine side of this. At a very basic level from the human side, one of the things I think we have to just be really intentional about is we often talk about the capacity building of people, et cetera. Each of us has a journey to go on, right? To create a relationship with this technology and really a relationship with the new way we can interact with knowledge. So I would break that down for people in kind of 4 ways. So the first is ta-da, right? Meaning you have to use it. You have to try it. You have to be able, to understand what its relevance to you might be. And this year we're excited. We're trying to lean in with others to do a lot more around what we would call role-based training, right? So if you're in acquisitions or if you're a lawyer, or if you are a logistics person, you actually show up with a different way, different relationship with different information. And so I think this year we'll see more entities kind of lean into that intimacy and say, like, hey, we got you. What you do is important and special. Let's make sure that we help you navigate and understand the right tool, kind of the right ways. But really, it's an individual journey beyond anything else that someone actually has to go on. So once they have their ta-da, right? Once you've started to use that tool, whether it's a public one or one inside, then quite frankly, you have these moments, the uh-oh moments, meaning, well, what does this mean for me, right? What does this mean for a good and intentional use? And that's actually a really important, time period to sit and think about those things. I think one of the things we had kind of go wrong in government or DoD is we put the uh-oh before the ta-da, right? And so when you actually put the uh-oh first, you end up repeating a lot of other people's fears and experiences because you don't have your own, interaction with the technology. And so that's why I kind of highlight, you got to use it in order to ask good, relevant, related questions to where it fits. Because the third stage is aha, meaning, oh, now I get it. Now in my role and my capacity in my way, I understand maybe what pain I'm going to, lessen, what process I'm going to highlight. But I can't emphasize enough that each of us as individuals, as Doug said, there's early adopters. But the reality is this is a very intimate tool, and it is not going to be kind of, rolled out. I don't think like everyone uses this and it's solved. We're going to see different people have different tools that work for them. And to Heather's point, a lot of that is because we have to have empathy, right? That what is it that someone needs? What is it that's going to advance that? So that aha moment is a lot about finding like that fit, right? And some of us are going to really benefit from a lot more human machine teaming augmentation in the beginning. And some of us, it may not be that relevant. And the last thing, which is kind of my goal, is that we actually get to the last stage, which is ho-hum, Meaning, if you met someone who'd never Googled it, you'd be like, what do you mean you've never Googled it? Like, we all do this, right? And so, ironically, I see the next year to say, well, how quickly can we contribute to getting, someone from maybe afraid or feeling that, that they're not enough to actually being bored and asking for the next greater thing, right? Because to Doug's point, there's really a process of demand where we need to have people want these commercial tools, right? We've got to get them through the ATO process. We've got to do all of that. And that's as much about, humans saying, I'm ready for the next, bigger thing. And I think it's exciting because we'll see a lot from the enterprise capability of how some of these public big tech companies are going to be ready to meet us, right, at kind of the level of security or data concern or training concerns that we have. But we have to be at a point where we've used the tools enough to ask smart questions, right, and to demand smart things as we acquire them, which is why, again, that use is critical. The last thing I would just say from a note, because I saw a great question in the chat, from the cyber frame, I think, this idea of bringing all knowledge, flows into play is going to have cyber challenges, right? Misinfo, poisoning, et cetera. But it also, I'm really reflecting on some of the cyber opportunities. So as an example, right now, when I think about knowledge, most of our critical treasure is in kind of these really big data lakes, right? And data sets, et cetera. And if you think about it, that's an incredible amount of knowledge in one place for an adversary. Counter to that, if you think instead about what I mentioned, RAG or retrieval augmented generation, where an individual can actually build their own, kind of knowledge universe, you're really talking about a diffusion of target, space for the adversary in a very different and unique way than we've had before. So I think we're going to see a really interesting year unfold around finding kind of both the pros and cons as we see kind of human behavior and these platforms shift the game board a bit.
Fantastic. And John, do you want to close us out on this one?
Sure. Just to add, those are great points to all. So I'll just say, like the personal journey that Alexis is talking about, I think one of the things that we hear from people that are trying to try this new technology and trying to understand what it means for them is the first thing that people get concerned about is, well, it gives me maybe incorrect answers. But part of that personal journey is to try and understand really the strengths and the weaknesses of the tool and trying to understand that, look, if I give it certain types of information, I get very reliable or more reliable information back. If I just ask open-ended questions, like asking any other human, you would get maybe very wide-ranging answers. But with very specific targeted information, with good prompt engineering, we get a better, more targeted answer, which people find beneficial. So very simple steps can lead to very important improvements. I'll also say it's this trust aspect. As you get to work with the tool a little bit, you start to trust it more on some areas and less on others. But that's normal as you try to use new technologies. And I think that's an important part of just getting that experience, getting time with the new tools to try it out. And last, I'll just say is security is an overarching comment concern. It's already been mentioned in many ways. I'll just say that I think we are making progress on understanding what are some of the security concerns, but also mitigations and steps that can be taken to use the tools prudently. Thanks.
Yeah, sorry, if I can just jump on, because John made a really important point, and I apologize for this, but the whole reason, that he's highlighting on potential hallucinations or what you can trust, what you can't, this is why it's so important that you actually start using the tools, because it isn't the same as Googling it. You can have a much more complex, rich relationship with knowledge. And I'd encourage people to think about two things as you're querying. The first is your expertise. So you are actually the biggest black box in the mix of the AI tool, right? My husband jokes that he wishes I had a predictable operating system, right? And so the reality is the fact that the AI is going to be different because I'm going to query differently than Doug, than Heather, than you, Laura. That's actually a feature, not a bug, right? And so we have to keep in mind that that's strong. What that means, though, is that if I'm querying something where I have a deep and high and long expertise, I'm more able to understand if what I'm getting is something relevant or not, because I can draw on my experience and expertise. If I'm querying something where I don't have experience or expertise, I may have to really double check, right? Or really ask for sources or do other things, before I use that information. So the first thing to understand is you actually have to understand yourself and what you bring to the mix when you query. The second part of that is impact, meaning how important is this thing I may action or choose to do after, this pursuit of information. So if this is something where I'm just trying to familiarize myself, I'm not actually planning on using it, we tell people to curate with abandon, but propagate with care. Meaning if you're just, looking, that's one thing. But if what you're creating might be something you're going to put forward in a process with others, et cetera, then you want to spend more time double checking it, et cetera. The same way as if a intern did an assignment for you, you wouldn't kind of not read it, throw your logo on it, and put it out as a press release, right? So that same editing and curation, it's just a different type of tool. But those are some things to complement what John said that we find as people go on this journey help really frame great expectations.
Fantastic. No, and please, all the panelists, do jump in. Like, this would be a fun conversation. I'll open some of I have one more general question before we get to some specifics and the chat. And this one really builds on some of the discussion on how we need to understand the capabilities. But how should the DoD balance the need for rapid adoption of generative AI with the requirement for rigorous testing and validation of AI-enabled systems? Heather, would you lead us off on this one?
I would love to. I think my first reaction to that is probably from years of working in test and evaluation, sort of, this idea that test and evaluation is the thing that slows down adoption and employment of all of these technologies, I think is something that we really should step back and think about. Test and evaluation uncovers, performance issues, and it helps us characterize what technologies are good for and what they're not. And sometimes that means we uncover problems that send us back to the drawing board for better and more updated designs. So, I think we have a little bit of a playbook for this. We've worked with the department in deploying rapid capabilities before, and the test community has always risen to the occasion to make that happen. And I think we can think a little bit about those same types of things when we think about how do we rapidly deploy AI capabilities as well. So, some pretty clear things to go after first, to the extent that we can, if we can build these systems for test, that means if there's instrumentation that we can include as part of the system itself. So imagine you have, several models strung together, for example, or, outputs of a model feeding some other piece of software. If we can instrument that so that testers are able to sort of engage in continuous evaluation and continually collect data from the system and how it's performing, we're a good portion of the way there. I think, to the extent that we can involve operators in the process, as I mentioned before, early and often, but also just, smart risk management. The department should start small and then scale up. So use generative AI in low risk, less critical areas first, right? Think about the mundane things that you're doing in your day-to-day. If there's a way for you to use AI to help with your calendar, for example, please do, right? And then we can scale up from there into mission areas where things are going to, get more dicey. And, testers are going to be there along the way, learning about generative AI and how to test them and to characterize performance right along with the department. And, I think that's exciting. And we shouldn't wait for the perfect system to do that. We should jump in and get our feet wet, engage in a lot of integrated testing, right? We want to see testing across the full development lifecycle of these systems so that we're intimately familiar with them and that we're testing all along the way. So we're viewed, the test community is viewed more as a partner than sort of a watchdog on the performance of the system, right? The testers are going to tell you, this is working for operators and this isn't, and clue you in to where adjustments might need to happen. And then I think, people are sort of moving in this direction already because our systems are very complex, but we'll need to do this for generative AI as well, which is to have mechanisms that let us sort of scale up testing environments so that we can combine live testing with simulation. Some of the sort of operational spaces for these generative AI systems that have been imagined are very, very large. And there's going to be challenges getting after those without some way to scale up test environments and to use both live testing and simulation to get at performance.
Doug, can I give the last word of this to you as the Director of Operational Test and Evaluation? What are your thoughts?
Sure. So one of the things that we see very quickly here is that the advent and push towards generative AI is really just a microcosm of a broader trend towards software-reliant systems. More and more systems are software-reliant. Almost all parts of systems are software-reliant. And one of the big insights we had from the software engineering community a couple decades ago that has become even more pronounced lately with the large complex systems that Heather was just talking about is the fact that software is never done. So software continually evolves. We can't just expect to build a system once and then ship it and then never change. Look at Microsoft Windows as a good example, where you have Patch Tuesday, where every so often you get a push to your operating system to update it. Same thing is true with testing. Historically, people tended to think of testing as a sort of the end of a continuum where you would do a bunch of different analyses and then decide the system is ready to be fielded. And while that may be true in some limited cases nowadays, it's really not true for software-intensive systems or software-reliant systems. And it's definitely not true for systems that are using artificial intelligence and generative AI, where those systems are designed to inherently adapt and have dynamic responses to external stimuli that change under different conditions. So one of the most important things we need to do as we move towards this AI-enabled future is rethink the processes that we have in place to do the testing and evaluation. So this is true for the contractor-based testing, which needs to be automated. It's true for the developmental testing, which are really looking at whether the systems work according to the requirements. And of course, it's also true for the operational testing, where we're looking at whether the systems work in the operational realistic conditions that they're going to be employed. And unfortunately, nowadays, we can't just do that one time. We have to be able to continually test because the conditions will change, the training data will change, the environments will change. And so it's really going to require rethinking the value proposition of testing and evaluation. So rather than have something that occurs, quote, at the end of the process, it really needs to be something that occurs throughout the process. And that means that we're going to have to get a lot more intentional with contractor-based testing of AI-enabled systems and developmental testing of AI-enabled systems, because by the time it gets to the operational phases, if the other phases haven't really been done thoroughly and effectively, we are in a very difficult position to try to identify what works and what doesn't under all the different conditions that we're going to have to encounter in the field. So I think that the bottom line here is that there's a real opportunity to rethink the world of testing in general because of generative AI. But these conditions have been coming into the forefront for decades now, and now we have to really get serious about it because we can't ignore systems that are intentionally designed to be adaptive and dynamic.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm going to throw a little curveball at the panel now and roll over to some audience questions. I think we've hit a lot of them through the discussion, but one that I'm particularly interested in your answers to are what are the AI acquisition support tools that don't exist yet but would be the most valuable or useful to the DoD acquisition professionals? And thinking big, as we were talking in the prep session, thinking big acquisition, so anywhere across the life cycle. Thoughts from the panel on what those tools might be? I need an email assistant. I need something to write my email for me, please. With that, feel free to jump in.
I can take a start at it. So there's many different types of use cases, many types of tools that are out there that would be possible. I think one of the first things is to try and leverage some of the benefits or the opportunities with generative AI is to scale up to handle larger document sets with all the policies, all the regulatories, information that we have, just to help absorb that and help, not just be a search repository, but to help understand how they interrelate and how they may be conflict at times. There's an entire area of the policy and regulatory environments that are so important for the acquisition community, and they were developed intentionally to help improve and accomplish certain objectives. But nevertheless, it can be very cumbersome because of the sheer size. So I think there's that area. And then I think a second thing we've talked about the SEI a little bit is how to, in the software engineering repository of all the information that's provided, how do we compare that data set, all the testing results, all the code, all the information from a software development process to all the regulatory environments and documents to see where there are consistencies or inconsistencies. So that's where there's an intersection between maybe software engineering tool sets and acquisition tool sets. So I think there's interrelationships there that we can also explore in the near future.
Yeah, I would complement that by saying, I think particularly when we think about this as a relationship with knowledge, what John said is we really exist in a number of different ways. So I like to think about it as like there's the me knowledge, the we, the us, and the them. So, the me knowledge is what is it that I need every day to do my work? And I should be able to kind of curate, have that, and again, I think we're going to see generative AI be something I've been really surprised as I've been able to watch people use some of the tools, like directly watch them use it. On the types of things that they're asking or trying to do. You can imagine, two things that are popular is I've got a lot of information, I got to make it less, right? Or I've got a little bit of information, I got to make it more. But I think it's really important to understand that AI is a learning tool, meaning the AI is supposed to learn and you are supposed to learn and adapt, right, with it. It is not a set it and forget it ERP or platform system. If you treat it that way, we are not using AI in the way it was intended. And so I think to that point, then there's the we information, right? So if we were all on the same team, again, I'll use kind of F-35, there may be co-curated information that we don't need to repeat 16 different individual times, but we want to use, right, as a knowledge base together. There's the us, right? So if I'm part of Air Force and Space Force, then, what is it that might be unique knowledge-wise to our forces? And then finally, kind of them, the public info, right? So for example, we don't need to import the NDAA, 640,000 times. And so I think this question that's really introducing for us is, what is the relationship with knowledge and how do we structure that? I think to Doug's point, one of the most critical things we're going to have to navigate this next year is we haven't yet taught people how to facilitate a conversation around this. And what I mean by that is we kind of assumed that like data people and AI people are the same people. And I would actually highlight that I find they're actually not. Data people tend to have been raised in, again, a very controlled, the data is supposed to give me a right answer. AI people are a little bit, sometimes more curiosity. And so what I would highlight is we need both of those. But as an example, what we have to be able to facilitate a conversation around is what's really the question that we're trying to augment the knowledge on. So for example, if the question is an audit and 2 + 2 needs to equal 4, well, then we may need to collectively curate to more controlled information, right? If the question is, what might the adversary do? There is no right answer anywhere that I'm aware of, at least for that. And so being able to lean into more curiosity, more kind of open information flow. So what I would ask people to reflect on, especially leaders, is as we navigate knowledge, we're also navigating our relationship with risk. So if the 5 of us were all, senior officers at a table, and we were trying to confront a question, if Laura had a really low relationship with risk, she may want to tend more to controlled or structured knowledge to answer that. If Doug has, a crazy relationship with risk, an incredible amount of field experience, and just goes with his guts, then he may be much more open, right, to less structured info and wanting to be informed by a larger parameter. So I highlight this because a lot of times we talk about the tech, but what we really need to start to do is to understand how we collectively are forming a new relationship with knowledge and be able to create the ability to have those conversations, to understand what biases we might be bringing in, and therefore make sure that the technology, the tools, the expectations are really reflective, kind of our humanity and of the challenge we're trying to bring, if that makes sense.
Fantastic. Doug, I noticed you're off mute. Do you want to chime in on this one as well?
No, I think I'll wait for the next question.
Okay, well, my next question was going to be to you. In particular, with your experience in prompt engineering and large language models, and the role that you serve at DOD as the current director, what do you see as the biggest opportunity for these technologies in operational testing? Are there any specific tools or applications that stand out?
Absolutely. So it's interesting. About 50 years ago, Frank Deremer and Hans Krohn wrote a famous paper called Programming in the Large versus Programming in the Small. And their main point was that the tools and techniques and processes that we use for writing small things are different than the processes, techniques, and tools we use to write large things. And at the time, there wasn't a lot of focus on programming in the large. Over the last 50 years, there's been a lot of focus on that in software engineering. I think we're very much in the same place with generative AI in general, and then specifically with respect to applying it in the context of operational test and evaluation. I think all of us on this panel and other people who are probably watching have become fairly facile with generative AI in the small. I find myself much more productive in doing mundane things than I've ever been before, because I can use it as a sanity check, and I can use it to give me a way to free associate and think and be creative while still keeping an eye on the output. The real challenge, however, becomes when we start trying to do this at a much larger scale. So, for example, one of the things we do at DOT&E is every year we put out an annual report, which is several hundred pages long, and it really tries to distill all the experiences and success and failures and so on of the test evaluations we do over the last 12 months. And one of the things that we learned from that is that people tend to focus on these things 1 year at a time. And that's because even though we've got something like 30 years or more worth of reports, humans have a very hard time plowing through all those documents, trying to observe trends and see things that are difficult when you just read it one at a time. So this is a great example of how we're beginning to apply generative AI tools to help us look across our annual reports to try to see if there are trends or there's certain topic areas, for example, autonomous systems or cyber risks, that are becoming either more or less problematic over time. And having the ability to use generative AI at scale to do this type of analysis is tremendously useful for decision makers, because it gives them a more holistic view of the challenges that we're facing as an organization and as a department. So I think those are some examples of places where we're beginning to use generative AI. But to go back to my earlier theme about programming in the large versus programming in the small, we're not finding the tools available yet, even with advances like retrieval augmented generation, are really allowing us to be able to do highly accurate and realistic comparisons across many documents. Generative AI tools typically work fairly well on one document, maybe a couple of documents at a time, but we're not really able to do analysis over all the annual reports for the past 30 or 40 years, because it just doesn't have the capability yet. So I think that's an area where we need more R&D. I would also emphasize very quickly that there's a lot of science and technology remaining here, and we should not expect in 2 years to solve all these challenges that the software communities have been working on for decades. So there's a lot of good advances still required, lots of great PhD dissertations for people looking at testing and evaluation of AI augmented systems, as well as the use of tools that are AI augmented in order to build these systems. So I'll just leave it there.
Fantastic. So I'm going to stay on the test and evaluation and get an audience comment in as well. So Heather, Dale Moore in the chat talks about concurring with your thoughts on continuous testing and continuous training. However, how do we test to gain enough confidence to actually certify ML-based AI for safety critical defense applications and systems? Is a question from the chat, and I'll also just expand on that to the original question that we provided on what are the implications that AI has for present test design and evaluation in the defense context more globally.
So
Dale, I think, the defense community as a whole, and certainly the T&E community, is grappling with the question that you asked actively as we speak. I'm not sure I have the perfect answer for you, but I think there's a lot of things that we're working through. One of them, I think, to Doug's point, these systems are a lot like, they pose a lot of the same challenges that software systems generally pose to us. I think one of the things that makes them perhaps a bit unique is the global impact of any updates to the algorithm. So, in some cases for traditional software systems, you can try to make sort of an isolated, localized fix and do some regression testing on that to make sure everything is working well. For these AI systems, I think there's not yet, and perhaps this is possible, but there's not yet evidence to suggest that those small updates are really that small, that they instead have impact on the algorithm at sort of this global scale. So, how do we start to make sure that when those changes are introduced, we don't have to do exhaustive retesting? I mean, that's a huge challenge for us. We've talked already about the issue of evolving systems, as these algorithms change. How do we, think about tests and evaluation? We started doing this through integrated testing already over the past few decades. We sort of laid the groundwork for, how do we create a more continuous evaluation of these systems, but we're going to need to push further on that and think harder about it, even into deployment. When these systems change, what's the right cadence for retesting? How do we do that? Have we instrumented the system appropriately to be able to support continuous evaluation? So those are all big questions. I think it's not a surprise to anyone that the test community, I think, is worried a lot about the training data, the underlying training data for these systems. Oftentimes that isn't shared with the DoD. And inside that data is sort of the treasure that we need in the test community to be able to make sure that the actual conditions were represented in that data set, to be able to understand and scope testing so that we don't have to do this big exhaustive test, right? If we can look at the training set and say some certain things were represented well, other things weren't, we can scope the test differently to be able to, characterize performance better in those places where we are assuming more risk in the training data, for example. So there's a lot of issues that the test community is working through on the whole, and they'll hopefully, by the end of the year, I'll have a little bit better answer for you. One of the projects that DOT&E has asked us to look into this year is about how we create test designs for AI-enabled systems and machine learning systems. What does that look like for operational tests? How does that, carry forward from developmental testing, for example? So that's something that we're actively doing research into now.
Fantastic. Thanks, Heather. John, I want to go to you next. Just given your background in software engineering and your extensive experience doing R&D for software, what are some of the lessons that you've learned over the course of your career that can be applied to the development and deployment of AI in acquisition or in systems?
Sure. I think some of those have already been touched on already. I'll just add that as we look to apply any new technology, including generative AI, to DoD systems, the first thing we usually suggest is look at specific use cases or mission threads, we sometimes call them, about how to leverage the benefits of the technology. Where can that really be leveraged the most in the use case for the mission thread? And then from there, start to look at a very simplified test or experiment to understand really the opportunities, the risks, and to get a sense of the level of effort to really integrate the capability safely into the system. That's a proven strategy that I think has been used extensively throughout software engineering, and it's proven it's very useful here as well. There are some new dimensions here with generative AI, including the training data set that was just talked about. And I think there's some other dimensions too, which is, in many systems, there's an input and a response sort of predictability that people want to have sort of bounded for certain mission use cases and for testing. And in this particular case with generative AI, it can be much more open-ended. So there may need to be architectural or other sort of constraints to limit or make to limit those the exposure in those cases, or take other extra steps to have the humans to be more involved in those specific areas. I think next thing is to focus on the continuous integration and the updates that are needed for real systems, like was just mentioned again. It's not just about bringing the technology in one time and starting to make it work. It's about sustainability, the infrastructure, the activities, all that's needed to maintain a capability both reliably and securely.
Fantastic. And thank you everyone for all the great questions. I'm working on filtering them together, but Alexis, I want to go to you next, because there's been several questions about the implementation of large language models, and should the DoD implement them in-house? How do we make sure that, there was one question about how can companies provide information to make sure that their models are trusted? And so my question to you is based on kind of your experiences and what you've been able to do at AFRL. What recommendations would you have for companies that want to invest in large language models, generative AI, and your thoughts on what the DoD needs to do to make sure that they have access to these tools in a cost-effective way? Sorry, that's a lot of questions.
Yeah, I was going to say that's a lot. So
we only have 5 minutes left, or 4 minutes left.
Right. So I would just say really quickly, the reality is that, it's going to be about the right tool for the right info at the right time at the right value. And so I think this is something where DoD should not try to do, for example, what big tech does better than big tech, right? And so finding ways, to use that. I also think that we're going to see a proliferation of smaller, specialized, even like curated knowledge sets and data sets based on, what we're seeing here. So I have been really excited as an authorizing official to get to have approved a lot of new, smaller AI platforms. And I think you're going to start to see from my standpoint, my goal is, give people a tool, but then help them very quickly graduate to what they actually need, right? So some people may only ever need a very basic LLM, which we can maybe get at high value by using open source models. But quite frankly, I actually want people to want more features, want things that we're just never going to be able to keep up with. So, from my strategic perspective, the goal for someone like, me as a CIO should in essence be, number one, follow the signal of my users. What are they actually enjoying using? What are they liking? I am not going to force, there's not going to be an overall mandate or dictated AFRL of we shall use this. It will be, what do you need to use? What works for you? Like what's secure? And if that means that we have 10 different tools, because guess what? We have a whole bunch of different missions, a whole bunch of specialty knowledge. Like that's okay. I would really hesitate for anyone to think that this is going to be a one ring that rules them all. In fact, I think that would be the most deadly approach to having this, technology maximize our national security, that we could have. And I think most importantly, the real thing that we also have to look at is how do we make it easier for things like authorization, right? And other processes. So I will say as a AO, I really hate being the villain of every story. So I'm really trying to ask myself, how can I be more of the hero? How can we make it easier to bring in, just the richness of tools and potential out there? So, hopefully we'll see a lot more of those coming down the pipe.
Fantastic. And with that, we are at the end of an hour. I should have known an hour with such a great panel was not enough time to get to all the questions. And thank you to the audience for all the questions. We will be keeping them and curating them. And Director Schmidt and I were already chatting about some things that we might do with them afterwards, including planning future events to start to get to these questions, or writing up some answers for those independently. So thank you everyone for joining today. Thank you to the panel for your insights and some great conversation that really triggered a lot of more more conversation for the future, clearly. All right, thanks all. Have a great snow day if you're in DC.